Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this generally weekly series I take a look at some of the comments that have appeared on videos and wherever from the past week and just add in my own thoughts in a way that doesn't necessarily warrant a full video. So going into the first one, and someone just commented on first past the post. Obviously it's come up quite a lot that the reason we're in the situation we are, particularly since 2010, is ultimately the first past the post system. But I'll read on the comment and then add my thoughts onto it as well. It says also some people, like Cameron, say that it leads to hung parliament, which is a British way of saying we don't want to cooperate in democratically elected parliament. We'd rather cheat the system to gain absolute power in a majority government. And also it's called coalition government, not a hung parliament. Not in this country. Of course, this is the difference between British politics and parliaments in many other European countries. And in the other European countries have proportional representation. Inevitably, that makes it very difficult for a single party to gain an overall majority. So, and that's expected every single general election. Every single one, you are going to return what we would call a hung parliament, which is where in those other countries, those parliaments, as you say, form coalition governments according to, what can get a majority and get through the various factions within that coalition government, their pet policies through, the ones they'd really like to enact. And there are many advantages to such a system because it tones down some of the more extreme promises that a party may have to make to get some of its more hardline supporters because they'd never be accepted by other parties. And it basically means you've got compromise politics naturally coming through. In Britain, it's very different. I mean, the way a parliament works is very much the same. The way the election works is not, because although we have been returning in 2 general elections in the past 10 years, minority governments, one formed a coalition, one did not. And it may well do the same again next month. We don't cooperate. This is the scenario, I will tell you now. So let's say Boris Johnson doesn't win a majority next month, but he is the largest party. He would expect to be Prime Minister and he will carry on bashing any other parties that don't do what he says. Because as far as he's concerned, he's Prime Minister. If Jeremy Corbyn becomes Labour becomes the largest party and Jeremy Corbyn as leader, he will do the same thing. We've already seen this, it's not speculation. As leader of the opposition, he insisted, because he was the largest party within the opposition bloc, which now outnumbered the government, or it did at the time, he insisted that he should be the Prime Minister under that situation and that they should do what he says. So we have this attitude, because our Prime Ministers are they've seen as they've been growing up and been going through their political careers, Prime Ministers have that power because they've had majority governments. But yeah, we do have a completely wrong mindset, and it is because of first past the post, because at some point, and it may be next month, a party is going to get a majority and everyone's going to think it's back to normal. The other problem we have with first past the post, of course, is it keeps returning Conservative governments. Conservative governments are not at all representative of Britain, of the general population. But they often win because they're very good at getting their supporters to turn out in large numbers, others not so much, and also others of the ones who do turn out, because the Conservatives don't always get 50% of the vote, in fact very rarely do, but the other ones split the vote amongst themselves, which allows the Conservatives in on an individual constituency basis, to say nothing of in Parliament. So yes, there is a different mindset, and ultimately it comes from first past the post, because if we had proportional representation, we would not expect to get majority government. It would become the norm and we'd have to face up to it. We can't keep having a general election every year or two, which is what was happening at the moment. If we have a hung parliament, because it is a hung parliament, there won't be a coalition. If we have a hung parliament after next month's election, that parliament will not last 5 years. It's supposed to last 5 years. It won't. It won't even last 2, will it? It'll be lucky to last 1. It depends on the exact balance. But it will not last much more than about 2 more years. Because without a coalition to support it, which we had 2010 to 2015, it's unsustainable. Completely unsustainable. But anyway, on to the next one. Now, it says you can get your postal vote sent to your university address like I have because my home constituency is more likely for Labour to win as both is Tory, blah, blah. So, I was talking about my advice for university students if they wish to vote tactically, because they get a choice. They can either vote in their university location where they live at university, or at their home location where maybe they go back during the holidays. You can't vote at both, but you can pick which one you want to vote at. That's all fine. Now, there are a couple of things you can do in theory, which I did not recommend in the video, because remember, it's my recommendations. It's not me telling people what to do. It's my recommendation. So there's one comment here talking about getting your postal vote sent to university address. I do not recommend that. I'll explain why in a moment. Other comments have also talked about proxy voting. I also do not recommend that. That one, though, is more on an individual basis. Use your judgment. The getting it sent to university address, I definitely do not recommend. I will explain why. So going back to May, the EU elections, what emerged from it, and both the Electoral Commission in the UK and the EU have also noted some very dodgy dealing. There were a lot of people, UK citizens, living outside of the UK who were eligible to vote in the EU elections, not being able to vote. There were also a number of non-UK EU citizens in the UK eligible to vote that also were disenfranchised, but that was a separate issue. I'm going to focus on the people who lived outside of the UK, because obviously they have two options, either a proxy vote or postal voting. Postal voting is the more straightforward. I'll come on to proxy voting. Now, obviously if you live abroad, it takes a while for letters to get to your location within the EU and back again. A good week indeed. So you need your postal vote, your ballot, arriving a clear week at least before the actual polling date so that you can get it filled in, sent off, done. This was not happening. There were a large number of UK immigrants in other EU countries, expats as we call them here because we think we're special, UK immigrants, who were not receiving those postal ballots until a day or two before the election, which made it impossible, unless they were going to get on the boat across the channel, to physically vote. They couldn't do, you can't do it. And this was deliberate. You can't be that stupid. There was strong suspicions that a number of, because it's down to councils this, individual councils, that individual councils were deliberately delaying the process by sitting on them and then sending them via a form of postage that would take much longer to arrive than it should have done. And as a result, and the Electoral Commission have said that this was bad. They haven't actually pointed the finger, as far as I know, and talked about wrongdoing, but they've certainly said that what was done was blindingly incompetent as of the EU Commission. And so the way I see it, call me paranoid if you will, the way I saw it is UK citizens living abroad are overwhelmingly likely to vote for pro-Remain parties. And that is why there was a deliberate conspiracy, really, to prevent as many of them as voting as possible. So let's now apply this to university. So if you are asking for your postal vote to be sent to a location that is not the address you registered for voting at, that basically is going to go in a big old pile that is relevant almost exclusively to university students. There may be others. You know, there might be some other people that for whatever reason split their time roughly equally between two addresses, and maybe the same thing there. But I am going to suggest that of all the people asking to do this, the vast majority of them are going to be university students. I'm also going to suggest that on exactly the same basis as what happened in the EU elections, the vast majority of students are likely not to vote for pro-Brexit parties. That is certain. So those same councils, if they did deliberately act to scupper those votes in the EU elections, will do exactly the same for these elections as well. I would not trust my ballot to arrive in time. I'm not saying it won't. And I'm not even saying it would be a major issue if a lot of people requested this. I just wouldn't trust it, and that's why it was not my advice. Now, on to the proxy voting. This is more straightforward. So the way a proxy vote works is you fill out a form, you have to sign it and everything, and you're basically saying, look, I'm not going to be able to vote at that polling station on that day. I am giving permission for this other person to take my ballot paper and vote for me. They have to physically go to the polling station and do the vote. Now, the reason why I wouldn't recommend that, severalfold. First of all, you rely on someone living at your home, your parents maybe, or a sibling, to do that for you. Obviously, you're more likely to be your parent, realistically. And what if your parents get postal voting themselves, in which case they're not going to go down the polling station, so that's not going to work. But let's say they do. Let's say they can get down the polling station, they agree to get down the polling station. Now, I'm not trying to turn parents against their children here, but what if your parents have a very different political view to you, and they really don't want you voting Labour or Liberal Democrat or Green Party or whatever you're going to decide to vote, and you're asking them to vote? And again, you may trust your parents implicitly, and it's up to you. I would suggest that, well, I will tell you, there is nothing to stop whoever you appoint to be your proxy vote going down to that polling station, getting that ballot paper and ticking whatever box they like. Now, you might argue the same thing, because my main advice was leave a self-addressed envelope at home and get someone to post your ballot paper when it arrives. And you might say, well, they still have to do that, and maybe they won't. If they didn't do that, that would be them explicitly betraying your trust, very openly betraying your trust. Whereas if they go to the polling station and vote for someone else, vote Conservative when you wanted to vote Labour, for example, you will never know. You will never know. It's not possible. You can't ask later on for your ballot paper to check it. It will never be known whether the person you trusted to vote for you voted the way you asked them to. That's why I don't recommend that. Now, obviously, if either of those things, you're thinking to yourself, no, you're just being paranoid, Phil, it'll be fine. Fine, that's your decision. All I was doing in my advice was saying what I would do, what my thoughts were. That's why I didn't go for those. So anyway, on to the next one. Oh dear, terrible one. Sorry, I had to put this one in. This was I'm not ever going to do a moron of the week type thing. I get plenty of comments that could be one. It's very negative, but this one totally blew me away. As stupid comments go, this one got me. So basically, I was talking about in the NHS how the Conservative government for the last 9.5 years have singularly failed to meet even their own targets. They reduced the targets from what Labour had for waiting time in AOE and still failed to meet those. And they were saying, untrue, total bias and misleading, propaganda drivel by Labour, expletives. How do I know this is true? Well, ask yourself, when was the last time you were treated at hospital by a politician? This is his masterstroke. He's a genius. Answer, only doctor, it should be a colon, by the way. Only doctors are responsible for the delivery of health and medicine, but sure, blame politicians if that fits your narrative. Capital letter on you're in the middle of a sentence. I'm not going to pick on the English. I've got more things to pick on here. This is the way some people think. This is why it's really important. If you think about anything, you must go out and vote. We have to outnumber these people. This person could just be trolling me, but they may genuinely think they've pulled a masterstroke debating point here. Of course politicians aren't responsible for the state of the NHS. It's doctors that treat people. I'm not even going to go into the who provides the funding. Doctors don't work for free. Who makes sure there's doctors there? They must think that politicians then do nothing. What are politicians responsible for? So they can't be responsible for healthcare because that's done by doctors. They can't be responsible for education because that's done by teachers, even though we have to teach what the government tells us. They can't be responsible for floods because, they don't organise the flood defences. They just direct those who do what to do and with what money to do it. They can't be responsible for anything to do with the environment, even though they pass the laws that say what companies can and can't do. They can't be responsible for anything. They can't even be responsible for laws, because even though they vote them through, they don't write them. Ministers sort of say what they want vaguely. You don't think a politician writes a bloody act of parliament, do you? Good God, you can't let them write bills. They're written by civil servants in conjunction with legal experts, some of whom are civil servants. And so literally, they're basically saying politicians are not responsible for anything. Anything at all. And why do we have them then? I wish I could talk to this person. Or do I? Do I really need to not ever in my life talk to this person? I really don't know. Anyway, let us quickly move on from that one. I just had to put it in. Right, so this next one is about Boris Johnson and his naughtiness in not nominating a UK commissioner to the EU. And it says here, this is what the French were afraid, the UK chaos stopping the workings of the EU. I guess they were right. Now, yes, it's certainly true that Macron was, when he was hesitating, well, when he was pretending to hesitate about extensions, certainly he's not wanted to give a long one. I'll go with that. Partly it's to look tough at home. I think that's the majority reason. But he did say, yes, we don't trust, particularly a rogue Prime Minister like Boris Johnson, not to frustrate our workings. You know, it's been not even an implicit pact, it's been explicitly stated that while we're in the process of leaving the EU, we do not monkey about with the workings of the EU. We've decided we don't want to be a member, so whilst we are and whilst we in theory have certain powers, we don't use them to frustrate their work. But Boris Johnson can't be trusted to do that purely because he wants us to be kicked out. He wants them to stop giving us bloody deadlines. So then he's refused to nominate. Now, what I will disagree with is about the French being right. So they're not, because his refusal to nominate a UK commissioner is not actually frustrating the work of the EU Commission. It would have been if all nominations had to be in before the new commission could sit, which I gather is supposed to be formally happening on the 1st of December. However, legal advice to the new EU Commissioner, who is van der Leyen, is that she can carry on her job. The Commission can carry on doing what it does without this nomination. It's fine. And the other thing, just as a little aside, I mean, as frustrating the workings of the EU go, this is fairly small fry. It's going to result in big consequences for the UK. I mean, we're already being taken to court over it, and we will be mistrusted in further dealings with them and other countries in future. But it is small fry as these things go. There is a school of thought, like at the moment, you've got the EU Commissioner and you've got a Commissioner for, I was going to say representing them, but that's wrong, nominated for by each individual member state. But those commissioners don't represent their member state. They're supposed to be independent. They're supposed to renounce well, not renounce. It's a bit like the Speaker of the House of Commons is supposed to be apolitical. The same thing with the commissioners. In which case, you don't really need, I mean, there were fewer of them before we had new members join. So if we manage with fewer of them, we can manage with fewer now. We don't need the sheer number. We don't need 30 commissioners. I know it's not quite that, 28, whatever. And the EU Commission President, so I suppose it is nearly 30. We don't need that many. So they can do without us. They can do without our commissioner. We are still in the process of leaving. To be honest, it's not a big deal. But it is a breach of EU law, and that's why they're right to take us to task over it. But it is not actually frustrating the workings. However, it could be laying the seed. It could have two advantages. From Boris Johnson's point of view, I just suggested it was there so he can back up his hardline Brexit credentials ahead of the general election, because they haven't said they won't nominate one. They've just said they won't nominate one before the general elections. And then it could be argued that if he gets his majority, he can just say, well, I'm still not going to nominate one because we're definitely leaving in January anyway. And then it could further be argued, let's say he finds himself without a majority, but he's still Prime Minister because the rest of Parliament can't agree on who else should become Prime Minister, with the same problem we had before the election. So he's still the Prime Minister. He could still refuse to nominate one then, on the basis that the next time we're asking for an extension, which if he doesn't get his majority and he can't get his bill through, we will be doing, the EU Council will be having their meeting and Macron will be going, I told you this would happen, didn't I? I told you, and you wouldn't listen. That is why we shouldn't offer him. Just let them go. Let them go. They've got a deal. They've got a withdrawal agreement. You know, they've not passed it, but they're going to have to. it's that or no deal. It's up to them. We'll leave it to them. Don't give them another extension. And maybe that'll work, and maybe it won't. But it could be argued, yes, he's covering all bases. He's maximising maybe his chance of winning that majority in the general election. If he doesn't, he's maximising his chances of us going out without a deal anyway. Next one. So this is again back to the NHS, with Boris Johnson blaming the failings of the NHS on higher demand. Which he is, yes, that's true. Says, does he expect demand to fall? No, he understands perfectly well, he's not a complete idiot, that demand is going to increase. And the reason demand is going to increase is not just because we have a larger population. It is because we've got more people having more health problems due to the fact more people are in poverty. Inevitably, if you can't afford decent nutrition and you're going to suffer from depression because you're in this crap situation, inevitably you are going to need access to more healthcare. In addition, they have removed funding from social services. So you get more people getting into really bad situations and then needing the NHS to take over those duties. You reduce funding on smaller scale healthcare, mental healthcare, physical healthcare, outside of main hospitals. So then that means they end up in the hospitals, put more pressure on A&E. All these things just add up to, of course, you're going to get higher demand. But of course, they're also less able to cope with demand, even if it was relatively stable, because where you are going to definitely get a jump up in demand, even without all the other things they're doing, is over winter as well. And if it can't cope in summer, which it didn't really very well, surgeries were being put off and appointments delayed and put back, even in summer. What's it going to be like this winter? Because of course the demand in winter is much greater. And it's not like some other industries that are more seasonal where you'll suddenly get more funding and more staff over winter. No, you don't. You just get put under more pressure to the point where the whole system collapses ultimately. But yeah, in terms of answering this, he does blame higher demand as if that's not his fault. Even though he has he and his predecessors, he hasn't been in long enough to personally have caused it, but his government, the Conservative government, have created the higher demand, effectively. But again, people will either see that or they won't. And if they see it, they won't vote for him. And if they don't, then they may. And then the last one. This is just Brexit in general, isn't it? England, Europe's little piece of the American empire, which, of course, after Brexit, particularly a hard Brexit, is what we will become. Indeed. What it prompted me in this one is Donald Tusk he said he's going to be like John Bercow. So when John Bercow stepped down as Speaker of the Commons, he was now free to say exactly what he thinks of the Prime Ministers we've had during this Brexit debacle and what exactly he thinks about Brexit in general. Very scathing he was. Donald Tusk, now that he's stepped down as EU President, has said the same thing. He said, I'm going to be like John Bercow. I'm just going to tell it how it is now. I had to be quiet about a few things, basically for diplomatic purposes. He's not a diplomat anymore. He can say what he really thinks. And it's pretty scathing, although, just like with John Bercow, of no surprise whatsoever. And what he commented on with relation to this, not in relation to this as such, but he was commenting on the fact that, a lot of pro-Brexit supporters are, they've got the misty-eyed about British Empire, effectively. They're trying to resurrect the British Empire, which is, of course, nonsense because we don't have the same tools. They're not allowed anymore. And quite right, too. But what he said was he was relaying from a British friend that he talked to who said that what Brexit actually represents is not the rebirth of the British Empire, but the actual final end of the British Empire. Because in many people's minds, they don't accept it's finished. But with Brexit, with a hard Brexit, it will become inevitable. We keep thinking we're exceptional, or say we as a country somehow think we're special. Of course we can get better trade deals than the EU, even though they're much bigger and more powerful. Of course we can, because we're brilliant. Everyone wants to do deals with us because we're Britain and we're absolutely amazing. And anyone who pays attention knows this isn't true. Those countries have already told us to piss off. There's already over a dozen countries planning on taking us to court because of the disruption to their economy that Brexit is causing. I mean, I don't know whether they've got any grounds to do that, but what it does to, and some of these are the countries that, by the way, the Brexiteers are saying totally want to give us a great trade deal. Well, then why are they taking us to court? That doesn't sound like they think that we're brilliant to me. It really doesn't sound like they think we're brilliant. But it's, you know, it's been said for a long time, and I don't deny it myself. The only way to show these people is to let it happen. But whereas some people think we should let it happen for that reason, I don't, because there's going to be a lot of innocent people suffering, and I mean really suffering. And also, I think that these attitudes will die in time anyway. They're predominantly amongst the older generation. They're not exclusively there. They're predominantly there. In the younger generation, they're not really there in any great numbers. And so time will eventually eradicate our British exceptionalism, I think. So I hope you found those little comments interesting. If you've got any further ones to add, then please put them in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click on the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.